Welcome to the Student Faculty Seminar of the President's Lecture Series and the Philosophy Forum. It's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Lynn Pascarella. She is a very accomplished person with stellar careers in scholarship, administration, and activism. As a scholar, she has published widely and prominently in primarily in ethics, but also metaphysics, and in ethics, particularly in medical ethics and the ethics of public policy. As an administrator, she has risen through the ranks, beginning at the University of Rhode Island, and is now president of Mount Holyoke College. And as an activist, she has worked effectively and on a wide scale to promote the careers and the health of women in Kenya and in this country. This evening at 8 o'clock in the University Center, you'll get a detailed account of her record and her accomplishments. And she will talk this evening about overcoming moral distress, reforming organizations and institutions. Our topic this afternoon is biology and the concept of death as un-American. Please join me in welcoming Lynn Pascarella.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. It's just such a beautiful area, and I'm thrilled to be able to have a conversation with you this afternoon about biology and the concept of death as un-American. During my last visit to our family practitioner, while sitting on the examining table clad in my paper gown, I waited as the doctor finished writing notes in my record. Without turning around, he said, "Let me ask you something. You're still on the ethics committee, aren't you? My partner has this case, and I'm wondering if the committee might help." He went on to describe an 88-year-old post-stroke victim who was hospitalized repeatedly for congestive heart failure, diabetes, recurring pneumonia, open wounds, and MRSA, a particularly resistant form of staph infection. Each hospitalization involved a 3 to 4 week stay. Throughout these stays, the patient was intermittently conscious and incompetent to make decisions for herself. Since she was unable to swallow, she was fed using peripheral lines. The patient's daughter, who would leave her mother's side only occasionally to sit in her car, insisted that everything be done to keep her mother alive. It was during the most recent hospitalization, when a mass was discovered in the patient's lung, that questions of futility arose. The daughter demanded that a biopsy be performed and wanted surgery if the mass turned out to be cancerous. The medical team was convinced that the patient should be allowed to die, yet the daughter was intent on doing everything possible to sustain her mother's life. What's frustrating, my doctor confessed, is that the staff feels like we're torturing this poor woman. But the last time we were able to have the next of kin declared incompetent to make medical decisions, the hospital lawyers insisted that we do everything to keep the patient alive anyway. My physician's case reflects two burgeoning trends in medicine. The first is the trend toward interpreting patients' autonomy rights as including the right to demand whatever's necessary for sustained existence. The second is responding to such cases with a liability-driven ethic. The thought is that since the doctor is likely to be sued anyway, always err on the side of life, no matter what the physical, emotional, or financial cost to the patient. These trends are not only interrelated, they are rooted in and bolstered by a deep-seated proclivity in American society to want to avert death at all costs and to avoid any open discussion of death. The use of medical technology in this and countless other cases has preceded thoughtful reflection about the social, legal, and ethical implications of the use of that technology, and societal reflection on if, when, and how patients should be allowed to die. Questions that policymakers need to address in an open colloquy include, how should we as a society allocate scarce medical resources? Can individualism be excessive in matters of life and death? How can we balance the values of pluralism and tolerance on the one hand against principles of fairness to all on the other? And most importantly, should we as a people continue to view death as a failure and thus distinctly un-American? The recent rhetoric surrounding healthcare reform highlighted as a society just how uncomfortable we are talking about death. In a culture in which television viewers are barraged with invitations to ask their physicians about treatment for erectile dysfunction, depression, high cholesterol, arthritis and fibromyalgia pain, and a host of other maladies, there was a staggering amount of sturm und drang over the proposed inclusion in a healthcare reform plan of a provision that would reimburse physicians for talking to their patients about advanced directives for end-of-life decisions or hospice care. Rumors of death panels and invocations of Nazi euthanasia programs led politicians to excise the proposal early on from the House Tri-Committee bill. The furor started with a post on Sarah Palin's Facebook page asserting that if the government passed healthcare legislation, boards would be set up to determine whether the elderly and disabled were worthy of care. On August 7th of last year, she wrote, "As more Americans delve into the disturbing details of the nationalized health care plan that the current administration is rushing through Congress, our collective jaw is dropping, and we're saying not just no, but hell no. The Democrats promise that a government health care system will reduce the cost of health care. But as economist Thomas Sowell has pointed out, government health care will not reduce the cost. It will simply refuse to pay the cost. And who will suffer the most when they ration care? The sick, the elderly, and the disabled, of course. The America I know and love is not one in which my parents and baby with Down syndrome will have to stand in front of Obama's death panel so his bureaucrats can decide, based on a subjective judgment of their level of productivity in society, whether they are worthy of health care. Such a system is downright evil." Though garnering the most attention, Palin was not the first to raise these type of concerns. Her post followed an earlier editorial in the Washington Times on how government plans for more funding for health information technology could be compared to Nazi eugenics programs. In addition, the former Lieutenant Governor of New York, Betsy McCaughey, commented on a program hosted by talk show host Fred Thompson that, quote, "Congress would make it mandatory, absolutely require that every 5 years people in Medicare have required counseling sessions that will tell them how to end their lives sooner." She misstated, perhaps out of genuine misunderstanding, the real intent of the legislation, which was to have Medicare pay for optional appointments to discuss living wills, health care directives, and other end-of-life issues. In the weeks that followed, there were statements issued by politicians warning against a policy that would push us toward government-encouraged euthanasia and the need to protect seniors from being put to death by their government. President Obama responded by maintaining, "Some of people's concerns have grown out of bogus claims spread by those whose only agenda is to kill reform at any cost. The best example is the claim made not just by radio and cable talk show hosts, but prominent politicians, that we plan to set up panels of bureaucrats with the power to kill off senior citizens. Such a charge would be laughable if it weren't so cynical and irresponsible." By disavowing the truth of the claim of death panels in this way, President Obama failed to address the real fear underlying the concerns of those who readily believed the rhetoric, namely the denial of necessary medical care at a time of urgent need. Thus, an opportunity was lost for meaningful debate over critical end-of-life issues that were pushed aside during the process of political jockeying. My goal here is not to dredge up partisan debates, but instead to draw attention to the nature of the fear expressed by people across the country. People are afraid the government will be allowed to determine what constitutes necessary care and who should be allowed to receive it. Americans want such decisions to be made by families in consultation with their doctors. They are afraid of loss of control in matters of life and death. They may not realize, however, the implications of not having a policy that encourages frank end-of-life discussions with personal physicians. Individuals may also fail to understand the extent to which they risk losing control under the current system, which discourages conversations surrounding death. Yet Americans' inabilities to confront our inadequacies around death should not come as too much of a surprise to those familiar with the medical literature. In the mid-1990s, the Journal of the American Medical Association published a series of research papers resulting from a 10-year, multi-million-dollar study on how we die in America. Sponsored by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the study to understand prognoses and preferences for outcomes and risks of treatment, SUPPORT, was the largest, most widely publicized research project examining end-of-life care. It revealed that dying in America has been unnecessarily painful, isolating, and costly as a result of physicians either not understanding or ignoring their patients' wishes. Excuse me. While designed to improve end-of-life decision-making and lessen suffering, the SUPPORT study revealed that none of the interventions that were introduced significantly influenced any of the outcomes that were designed to improve end-of-life care. Over 50% of the patients reported dying in moderate to severe pain, with the extension of life not correlated with an improved quality of life. The results of the SUPPORT study were so shocking to the funding agency that Robert Wood Johnson commissioned a series of papers done by the Hastings Center exploring the study's conclusions as to the circumstances in which many of us die and how difficult it might be to make the process any better. In the end, the funding agency reported, one of the most insightful explanations of SUPPORT results pointed to a popular and medical culture that is so forcefully resisting the notion of death that families, healthcare practitioners, and patients themselves are unwilling to ask questions and make the kinds of decisions that would diminish the fear surrounding the process of dying in this country. To illustrate this point, in his article entitled How We Lie, Boston University ethicist George Annis recounts Sherwin Nuland's experience with a patient, Hazel Welch, described in his book, How We Die. Welch was a 92-year-old arthritis victim who suffered a perforated digestive tract after a fall. Though competent and adamant in her refusal of treatment, Nuland persists in his attempts to persuade his longtime patient to undergo surgery. Welch agrees reluctantly because she trusts her doctor. The operation is more complicated than expected. The suffering is intense afterwards, and the patient dies from a stroke 2 weeks later. While Nuland at first says he would have done things differently after this experience, he recants upon reflection. It's a lie, he admits, for surgeons do everything, no matter what the cost to the patient, rather than risk the scorn of their peers. Nuland remarks, it is in such matters that ethicists and moralists run aground when they try to judge the actions of bedside doctors because they cannot see the trenches from their own distant viewing point. The code of the profession of surgery demands that no patient as salvageable as Miss Welch be allowed to die if a straightforward operation can save her. And we who would break the fundamental rule, no matter the humaneness of our motive, do so at our own peril. Viewed by a surgeon, mine was a strictly clinical decision, and ethics should not have been a consideration. Physicians are taught to do everything, and if there's nothing else that can be done, don't talk about death. Under these circumstances, Annis is convinced that the only way for people to change is to take them out of hospitals before they die, or never admit them in the first place. If a competent patient clearly expressing her wishes is not listened to, what chance do we have of being listened to when we are no longer competent? Annis suggests that our attitudes about death and dying are too deeply ingrained to be able to make a difference. For this reason, the process of dying, particularly in the hospital setting, is often characterized by feelings of abandonment and loss of control on the part of patients and their families. Anticipation of a hospital death is often overwhelmed then by fear that dying will involve a complex strategy designed to maintain vital functions rather than address human suffering and dignity. Interestingly, none of the political and social developments surrounding the issue of the right to die have been effective in promoting a gentle, peaceful death in the hospital setting. A decade and a half after the release of the support study, little has changed. Americans are still reluctant to talk and think about death. The mere suggestion of rationing to address the $66.8 billion a year of Medicare that goes into treating chronically ill patients in their last 2 years of life has led to cries of socialized medicine. At the same time, more than ever, death has become a negotiated event. The vast majority of Americans who die in healthcare institutions do so following a decision between the physician, patient, and family to forego treatment. Indeed, because death reflects more of a negotiated process than a discrete event, bioethicist Nancy Doubler contends that collaboration and negotiation need to replace the raw exercise of power that appealing to futility represents. This in and of itself will require more meaningful conversations between families, healthcare providers, and patients around death. In advising healthcare providers, patients, and their families on whether an act of treatment refusal is permissible, bioethicists focus on, among other things, whether the act is consistent with the goals of medicine. These goals consist of healing, sustaining life, preserving functions, and alleviating suffering. Professional commitments that guide professional behavior and the goals of medicine, including prolonging life, serve as a model for adjudicating cases. Given the human and economic toll our current approach takes, perhaps it's time to abandon sustained existence regardless of the quality of life or impact on society as an end of medicine. This would require a shift in the American view of death, one promoted by a former colleague of mine, Al Killalay, in his book, The Politics of Being Mortal. Dr. Killalay argues, in trying to come to terms with our own mortality, we might first consider that our species could not survive without death. As humanity is accustomed to taking its obvious blessings for granted, perhaps it takes its seeming causes for granted and misses the paradox of how much death contributes to life. One important way of accommodating ourselves to the fact of death is to imagine the fulfillment of our fantasy of immunity from death. If we were not to become quickly enmeshed in a staggering population explosion with a static gerontocracy, we would have to fantasize as well about an end to aging and to reproduction. With no reproduction, we would have no gametic change or renewal, and thus would have to be satisfied with humanity's current level of development and an end to the dynamism in nature that spurs civilized change. Would avoiding the vulnerability, suffering, and grief surrounding death be worth the cost of losing the challenge and joy of creating new life and experiencing growth in ourselves and others? My friend goes on to quote Talcott Parsons, Renee Fox, and Victor Liddy, who argue that death is an important mechanism enhancing the adaptive flexibility of the species through the sacrifice of individuals. That is, it makes certain that bearers or newly emergent genetic patterns will rapidly succeed the bearers of older ones. Death is critically important, these theorists maintain, for supporting genetic change. Thus, they say, we may regard death as a major contributor to the evolutionary enhancement of life, and thereby it becomes a significant part of the aggregate's gift of life that all particular lives should end in death. That's why it cannot be a rational pursuit of modern medicine to end or even minimize the inevitable aspect of death. Viewed in this way, death doesn't seem half bad. Maybe the point my friend makes in his book is right, however. It's not death we fear as much as it is annihilation and the absurdity of a meaningless life. For him, it is only through a recognition and acceptance of human interdependence that meaning can be given to both death and life. And it is only through greater candor about death that the anxieties and fears of citizens will be lessened and meaningful dialogue will ensue. Indeed, until we're willing to have a national conversation about the impact of a more open treatment on death on issues of social justice, I suspect that my doctor's visits will continue to serve as ethical consults. For healthcare providers are likely to experience ever-increasing moral distress over how to abide by the Hippocratic oaths enjoinder to first do no harm in a society in which death continues to be viewed as patently un-American. So, thank you. What I want to do here is stop. I know this is a shorter talk than usual, but I want to have an open conversation about death because that's the whole point of the paper. So, what do you think? Comments, questions? Yes.
One contributing factor to the terrible situation that you have described is the unwillingness or the inability of people to just accept facts that are out there. So you're right that an opportunity may have been missed when the death panels thing, sort of dominated the media. But I think it's equally distressing that the facts weren't hard to come by. And there are other facts that you mentioned some of those regarding the genetic renewal of the human species, which I think is not a good idea. And
I didn't think it was likely to persuade you, but
and then there is evidence that you know better than I, which shows that in many cases, perhaps the majority, doing nothing and just doing palliative care may even prolong life and certainly leads to a higher quality of life. So there are all these facts out there, and I agree with you that engendering a discussion is the problem. But one big obstacle in the way, sort of I don't know what I should call it, this cognitive disability that the population suffers from.
well, we really need to, we need to enhance scientific literacy, that's for certain. We're woefully behind other countries in terms of our science knowledge. But we also should expect from journalists and from healthcare providers an ability to frame the issues in a way that's more understandable. So there has to be clear communication about the basic facts that you mentioned. And it has to. So we have to partner with K through 12 and with the media to make sure that we're communicating messages effectively. And we have to be willing to have the conversations. Yes.
In your experience in other cultures and in other parts of this country, do you find regional differences in expectations surrounding death and dying, or differences from one culture to another in, say, European cultures or African cultures?
Yeah, there's certainly much more willingness to confront death and to have open conversations about death in other cultures. And I was talking to one of my colleagues at Mount Holyoke who does embryology. And so she was talking about the fact that here, as soon as we find out a woman is pregnant, we start throwing baby showers. And that's not the case in many other cultures. And often gifts aren't brought to the child until the baby is 6 months old, because there's an understanding and acceptance that the child might not live. And here, that's part of death being un-American. It's inconceivable to us that we're not going to succeed, that we're not going to get what we want, and this child will be healthy and perfect and beautiful. So yes, there's a wide range of differences among cultures, and even with the United States, because we are such this melting pot in a pluralistic society. Yes?
A macro and a micro comment, if you will. The micro one is my limited personal experience, but 3 specific cases where care institutions agree that they are going to or have ignored DNR requests, signed by sane patients, and then, send bills for $40,000 and usually not paid. But of course, I guess that gets back to the mission to keep people alive, is that, they'll say, yeah, we know it, we knew it was there. So that's, I guess, kind of a micro thing, but it's pretty pervasive from what I understand. The other thing is, you're talking about the healthcare professionals' desire to prolong life, but for a lot of reasons, including experience of their peers, they're very inadequate relievers of pain. They tend to not use available opioid-type substances in amounts that, in other words, they won't administer it until the pain returns and that kind of thing. And I think that's part of a tension also between we're going to keep you alive, but we're not going to relieve any pain until we know you have some.
Mm-hmm. And those are both good comments, and I see that as well. And part of it is that the physicians aren't the ones on the front lines dealing with the patients who are in pain, and so they're not getting those reports as directly. But there is still conversation about fear of addiction among healthcare providers with patients, even if the patients are terminally ill. And I think in every case, I've never seen a physician who's acting maliciously. I mean, they're always acting with the goal of beneficence and not doing any harm. And it's just a disagreement over what constitutes harm and the reality of the situation. And I know in many instances, patients are eager to please their physician, and so they don't report the reality of the suffering. Yes.
Are there, I think they call them right to die policies in certain states? And do you know of any such policies, and how well received are they by the people in the states? I'm thinking of Oregon as such a thing.
Well, the right to die language first came in 1990 following the case of Nancy Cruzan, who was the woman who was traveling on a road in Missouri on a January night, and her car flipped over, and she was thrown from the car and landed face first in a ditch. And the lights of her car were shining across the field, so a farmer noticed them and called the rescue squad. And by the time they got to her, she had been submerged in water for 15 minutes. And so she was left brain dead. Or she was in a persistent vegetative state. She wasn't brain dead. And so she, unlike the earlier case of Karen Ann Quinlan, didn't need to be on a ventilator, but she couldn't feed herself, and so she was fed with tubes, gastrointestinal tubes, or nasogastric tubes. So her family went to court and petitioned for the right to remove the life-sustaining treatment. And the court ruled for the first time that we could accept a right to die based on a patient's right to autonomy. What the family needed to do was provide clear and convincing evidence that this was consistent with her wishes. So as a result of that, and in 1990 there was the Patient Self-Determination Act that required physicians in hospitals to give patients information about the right to refuse life-sustaining treatment. And so there's been a lot of philosophical debate over whether there's a morally significant difference between killing and letting die. Would it be worse to give a lethal injection to a patient you know is going to die, or than to let the patient die, sometimes in agony? So those moral arguments have sometimes made it into the courts, but there haven't been any successful arguments in support of active euthanasia as opposed to passive euthanasia. But there is legislation that allows for assisted suicide. Yes?
To what extent do you think the economics of our medical system plays into our unwillingness to talk about death? Because care is provided on intervention is provided on a basis of being able to pay for it, either through insurance or through some other source. And so even if care doesn't seem to be particularly useful, there's still reimbursement for it until the patient absolutely dies. It doesn't seem like we have as much trouble in society in letting a person who is uninsured or a person who has no source of payment die.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that people are constrained. I'll talk a little bit about this tonight, in this notion of moral distress. People are constrained by organizational and institutional cultures. Healthcare providers feel a moral obligation to provide care. And I was just reading a case of an internist who was agonizing over a situation where the patient was an illegal immigrant, and he knew this, and the patient had life-threatening heart disease. And so the question is, do you provide the treatment knowing that the cost isn't going to be covered, and how much of a good Samaritan should you be? What's the scope of your responsibility? But I think that's how I started this paper in talking about a liability-driven ethic, And the reason that we keep patients alive rather than let them die is that we know that if we're sued, if we err on the side of life, we're more likely to be successful than if we let the patient die, even if we think it's in the best interest of the patient. So I agree with you that so much of what goes on is driven by considerations of liability and economics, and not always what's in the best interest of the patient or in the best interest of the profession.
I think on that same level, when I worked in a hospital, you almost gave more consideration to the people that were not insured, because a predictable lawsuit, if you didn't do everything that you could, where I could walk in with something similar, and they'd say, well, maybe your insurance isn't going to cover that MRI or that CAT scan, so let's try some other tests first. But the uninsured person, they seem to give almost preferential treatment. I just recently dealt with my mother getting a pacemaker, and before while we were talking with the cardiologist about the pacemaker, I said, now if she's going to die from something else, if she gets cancer, she's failure to thrive, something happens, will you turn the pacemaker off? And I couldn't get a guarantee. He couldn't get anything. We couldn't get anything in writing. She has her advanced directives all set. We went into the hospital, said anything out of the OR that happens, we'd want to do not resuscitate, and we couldn't get any orders written. So I think it's really important to have a medical power of attorney, have that listed. You have to bring those papers with you to the hospital, which we had all those, but still couldn't get her advanced directives, although they were in the chart, having posted her wishes in the room. So I think you really have to have the physician on board. You have to have the orders written, physically written, and have them sit them down and make them do it if they won't. But therein lies the dilemma. If something happens to my mother and someone else is on call, and the physician is just, giving you a yes, I'll agree to those terms, it has to be better than that.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of ethical issues that you've raised in your comments. There's the ethics of over-testing and the price that patients have to pay for that. So in the state where I was living, in Connecticut, there is a law that was passed that said if women have a breast density of a certain percent, then the physician needs to recommend that they go beyond a regular mammogram and go get an ultrasound. Well, in almost all of the cases of the ultrasound, they're finding something that has to be followed up on. And so women are undergoing a lot of biopsies and a lot of discomfort as a result of physicians having to protect themselves as a result of this law that came in because the governor was a victim of breast cancer. And that's how this law got through the legislature. Women should get tested, but this is a problem of over-testing that seems to be driven by liability as opposed to any realistic chance that it's going to improve the health of women in the state. There was a case that I dealt with, a couple cases involving children who were anencephalic, so they didn't have brains but had brain stems. And in every case, the Attorney General stepped in and demanded that everything be done to keep these babies alive, even though if the patient didn't have that particular handicap, we would allow the patient to die. So it's really violating what I consider to be the equal protection rights of people who are handicapped for the sake of, again, protecting the hospital and the state from liability. So there are a whole number of ethical issues that come up in any particular case. And you're right, we should have not only durable powers of attorney, but living wills so that you have the best chance at coming at the end of life issues from a number of different perspectives. So it's not enough that you've checked off all the boxes. You have to have somebody there who knows that these decisions are consistent with the way that you lived your life, exercising substituted judgment in a way that's authentic with how you've lived your life in order to make the best end of life decisions.
Some things. It happens that I'm a physician, and the business about the Hippocratic Oath we never said the Hippocratic Oath. I never met a physician who knew really what was in it or took it seriously. It says, thou shalt not cut for stone, which we do every day in the hospital. It says, thou shalt teach this art unto the children of thy teachers and to none other. But originally we had non-physicians. And primum non nocere is not something that people take seriously either. Most of the things we do have a risk of. So that isn't what physicians are thinking when they're none of those things. Money, particularly in some of the cases that have gone up, I don't think it's money. Most people don't benefit. The doctors don't necessarily benefit. The hospitals sure as hell don't benefit. They would love some of these people to die because normally they get paid in the lump sum or not at all. And after the first several days, that's taken care of. And then it's just a drain on resources. I don't think it's money very often. Lawsuits, I think that's the one that most physicians would say is the issue. I don't believe it's the issue. I believe lawsuits is a straw dog that really, who knows about all these things about people who've been sued for not doing more. I never heard of one. I mean, I don't say they don't exist, but people exist because, I mean, there's lawsuits because people get hit by lightning too. So what is it? And I would, in my personal estimation, I think it's an emotional, the emotional danger, the difficulty. We're always in a position of trying to please patients. We're not trying to do the right thing, we're trying to do the right thing. But the first thing, I work in the emergency room, the first thing we try and figure out is, what does this person want? What will please this person? It isn't just enough to get the right medical answer. Obviously, we try and do that too. So I can come in and I can treat you down the line, stuff that's very easy to do at no great emotional cost to myself. If I have to talk to you about the fact that, well, about dying and about what's going to happen and all of a sudden the peril goes up astronomically. And I believe it is this particular thing that the physicians who have difficulty dealing with death, I believe this is the impetus that causes us not to do the right thing.
So what do you think about the growing trend toward hospitalists?
What do I think about it?
Yes. Is it something that's necessary, or does it create ethical challenges that you think should be avoided?
For instance, what would be the, I'm sorry, I may have got here a few moments late, but what would be the ethical challenge?
Well, just the fact that in end-of-life care in particular, the hospitalist can provide round-the-clock care but might not know the patient in a way that a primary care physician would, and so isn't making the decision that's consistent with the patient's life.
Well, two things. One is that before there were hospitalists, hardly anyone has a doctor these days, it seems like. Before, when there were good internists and family doctors, before there were lawsuits, before there were panels, before there were medical ethicists of note, they took care of their patients, by which I mean that they would help them out of life when the time came. It still happens. It's become fraught with somewhat more peril. But I don't think it has anything to do with the hospitalists. The hospitalists, for instance, here's where I see the issue. I think the hospitalists are happy for people to die if it's the right time. I mean, when we talk, we just say, man, it's her time. But other factors get involved. What people can't assess, what patients can't assess, is what it really means when they're offered treatment. I don't care who you are, unless you've been there and seen this happen 1,000 times. If I say you can get, well, 20% of people respond to this or something, you can't assess what that means, which is that you're screwed. Do you know what I mean? I know you're screwed, and there's just too much writing on it. And people, we have this, nobody dies in this town. It says after a courageous fight with cancer, that's the ethic that we have, in our society, which is a courageous fight, by God, I'm not going to give up, It's an emotional issue. It's not even a cognitive issue, except that emotions are what determine our cognition. But I believe, but it's an emotional issue that's not dealt with, and it's a great peril to docs, and some are good at that, a few, and some are not.
That's a great point. There's a famous legal case in which a doctor was sued for giving his patient too much hope. The patient had pancreatic cancer and said, you can undergo this treatment, and he died, and the family sued for saying we shouldn't have put him through this because by the fact that you said there was treatment, gave him more hope than he really deserved.
The 5-year survival of pancreatic cancer is less than 1%, So what is this treatment?
Yes, well, it's chemotherapy, but should you say to the patient just that statistic and say, don't bother trying anything else, you just go home and die. Spend time with your family, which is what this patient was looking for. And I understand your comments are particularly valuable because that's very difficult to say. You might think it's the right thing to do, but it's very difficult in many instances to do what we know is right.
And the chances of it being poorly accepted, or them being angry, or it's like going home to your wife. It's fraught with peril.
Okay. Anybody want to comment on that?
He said it's really true about doctors being afraid to step into this emotional, and the patients being afraid to hear it. When my mother got cancer, we decided not to pursue treatment, but we could not get a doctor or a nurse or anyone to tell us what was going to happen, how she was going to die, what she could expect to happen. And so she died in fear because no one would tell her what to expect. If she'd just known what to expect, then she would have been more comfortable. And it was finally a hospice volunteer worker that sat down with her and told her what was going to happen. And then it was like, okay, I can deal with that. I just need to know.
Yeah, I think we can learn a lot from hospice.
Yeah, but I think everybody has to get into the conversation.
Yes.
A couple of times you've commented on, or used the term victim, breast cancer victim, stroke victim. I'm wondering if, victim, it's not like you have a disease, you're a victim of a disease, conjures up some sorts of emotional issues too that I think are kind of prevalent in our society and take away some of the power of that person. And so if you're seeing somebody as a victim, you might be tending to be more paternalistic also, and trying to make decisions. So I think it's the view.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I know that when there was a lot of discussion a couple of years ago about people who were cancer patients who were told if they had faith, then they were more likely to recover than if they didn't have faith. And I thought about the implications of that for people who couldn't make that leap of faith, and were we then blaming them for not doing as much as they could to help their own recovery. So how should we talk about it? What language should we use?
I don't know. It just struck me that, if I have an illness, I don't believe that I want to be labeled as a victim necessarily. That's part of the, it's like we're talking about death is a part of life, illness, injury, might be.
Can you speak up just a little bit?
Yes, sir.
I was just saying that I think that death is a part of life, and I also think that illness and injury often are components of life. And I think of a victim as somebody who was assaulted or that kind of thing, but I'm not sure. If that, I'd like your opinion, is that labeling a person as a victim change their status?
It probably does, yes. It probably enhances that power differential, and that's a really good point, that this Whorfian hypothesis that the way we talk reflects the way we think, and that influences the way we act. And so if we have more neutral language around disease, that might help us to deal with the reality of disease and the concepts of death.
I was thinking a comment or corollary in the mental health field and disabilities would be that switch in language that's taken place. Survivor, of course, that's down the road some, has been used more often, but just putting the person before the name, a person with cancer, a person with something. The person is always first, and it takes a little doing to get that out, but it forces you to think differently, and so I don't know if we could get that to happen in the medical field, but it's worked well, and I mean, it really has changed both the client, patient perspective on themselves and the providers.
I think another thing we should talk about more is the success in the states that have been able to use physician-assisted suicide. Not only the low numbers of people that actually use it, but even lower the numbers of people that have, there's certainly peril and fraud within that as well, because there's a lot of difficulty in getting a pharmacist that will get you the drugs that will allow you to do it, even though the law's in place, and our state's trying to legislate that. Hopefully we'll legislate it soon. But the numbers of people that obtain the drugs, and then how many of those people finally, in fact, use them, it's about half. So again, we're talking about the comfort in being able to just, the comfort of having those drugs in your house, I think really leads people to not use them, because they feel like if they get to their last straw, they have them, they can, but they're comfortable with the fact that they're dying. And I think we need to have, like you say, much more open levels of comfort in dying. I mean, none of us gets out alive.
Right, we haven't had the slippery slope occur, and the statistics you point are really important, that people aren't using it, but it provides a measure of control and comfort to patients who are afraid that they'll be left to die alone and in agony.
There are certain problems that cry out for philosophical clarification and advocacy. And clearly the end of life is one of those. So I have two questions. The first is, has the profession of philosophers been equal to that task? And secondly, to whatever extent it has been, is there at least a consensus on that issue, or are philosophers all over the place, so you may as well not ask them, because it's just sort of an accident who you ask.
Yeah. Well, I think that the service that philosophers can provide on ethics committees regarding end of life or any ethical issues is really framing the issue in a way that helps healthcare providers work through the issues, to identify the problems, to think about the different ways to approach the problem. In every case, the ethics committees are serving as sounding boards as opposed to decision-making, policy-making bodies. And so that's what we do, is really to frame the issues in a way. We raise the questions, but we don't have to provide answers, which is a nice position to be in. But I think that we have provided some valuable service in terms of helping patients work through issues and families, in addition to the healthcare providers.
PBS has been advertising an upcoming Frontline episode that deals specifically with all these issues, by the way. And I can't remember exactly when, but it's soon. A full Frontline.
Yeah, they do a good job.
This is just like an empirical question, but I mean, the situation as you see it, is it one where you've got people who are at the end of life and would prefer that their life end sooner rather than later, that a significant number of people in that situation would like to have at least the option that their life ends sooner rather than later, and they're not able to have that wish honored. Right. Is that the situation, or is it, so if that's the situation, what mostly needs to change is the professional codes among doctors and the legal apparatus, and then kind of like, then maybe the deeper problem of then the norm, it's like, in that case, there's a norm that's already sort of active in the culture, it's just not it's not being honored. Or do you see it more as that even people who, have a very compromised existence and perhaps are in a lot of pain with no end in sight, that they themselves, in a sense, are enthralled to this norm of death is a failure. I just wonder which characterization you would.
Well, I think there's
characterization of what's happening right now.
And there's been a huge shift. So when I started on ethics committees in the mid-'80s, almost all of the end-of-life cases involved patients who were trying to refuse life-sustaining treatment, and there were physicians who were opposing that. I lived in a small community that was Catholic, and so there was a lot of resistance from physicians about end-of-life issues. Now, almost all the cases are cases involving patients demanding futile treatment. And the healthcare team feeling uncomfortable with respect to allocating scarce medical resources when they think that it's not going to come to any good end, that the patient should die. And that's been a dramatic shift.
What caused that shift?
I think it really is a result of the technological advancements preceding thoughtful reflection about the use of the technology. So we haven't come together to talk about policy issues, but we have the capacity to keep patients alive. And so there is a sense that medicine can do anything. There's nothing that you can get that can't be treated given advancements in technology. So it's holding out for hope. And then an unwillingness to accept that not all life is an overriding value. That there are some circumstances under which the value of life can be overridden.
So this really is about, I mean, that's really interesting to me and a little bit surprising. So then you understand a little bit more that there may be a kernel of truth in this sort of rhetoric you were reading off earlier about, I want to be the one, or my family to be the ones who get to decide when treatment is warranted. And I don't want the government to decide that for me. Mm-hmm. And so the situation on the ground you're seeing, you're just describing is one where, in fact, that's the direction we need to move in. Because, okay.
Yeah, I think we do seriously have to look at the question of whether continued existence should remain as one of the goals of medicine.
Well, isn't autonomy the main value here? Isn't that what people who say, well, I don't want the government to decide, isn't what they're saying, I want to be autonomous?
Yes.
Okay.
But that's why we have to ask, does the right to autonomy include the right to be given whatever is necessary for sustained existence? And if it does, who's going to bear the cost of that? And for how long? Yes?
My question is about language, like some of the previous questions. I spent the first half of my life in one of the countries that was demonized during the healthcare debate in the UK. I'm a pretty big fan of the system there, and members of my family have had some wonderful treatment under that system. And so during the debates, I tried to think about, how might one frame that system in such a way that it wouldn't be demonized? What's a sort of positive narrative that one could come up with for that system? And there's two things I want to mention, and I want to ask you for a positive narrative. One thing is that in the UK, there isn't this language about faceless bureaucrats making your decisions for you. That there's people grumble about the NHS, but people love the NHS. It's an important part of the culture there. And the language of sort of bureaucratic limitation of our treatment, it just doesn't seem to appear, if I'm remembering correctly. So that's one sort of positive way to reconfigure that language. The other one, I think, is there isn't, here it seems to me there's medical care is it feels like it's a market. It feels like you can shop for a physician. If you don't like one, you go to another one. it feels like you can demand a treatment that maybe one physician isn't giving you, and you can find someone who will offer you that treatment. In the UK, I might be overstating it, but it appears that there's more humility in the face of the patient and more trust in the patient-physician relationship. I mean, you have your primary care physician, your GP, and you don't sort of think, well, if I don't like what that person says, I'm going to trade them out for another one. So there's two ways that I think you can sort of reconfigure that language in a positive way. What would be your recommendations for changing the discourse? Because what you made clear at the start of your presentation is that the discourse is inadequate. And in some sense, the discourse is facile. So what would be your recommendations for moving to a different, better discourse?
My recommendation would be to support primary care physicians to a greater extent. Right now, they're completely under siege with the burdens of having a practice where they are paying attention to patients and also having to go to hospitals in many areas. And running a business, and so many physicians are moving either toward concierge medicine, what you describe, where they are having patients or clients who will hire them to do the kind of care that we used to get from our family practitioners. And so I think supporting a system where physicians aren't encouraged to go into this phenomenon of, it's called hitting the road. They go into dermatology and radiology and things that are low risk, but are still allow them to practice medicine. And so it's valuing the people who are doing the real work that needs to get done in order to provide adequate health care and have meaningful conversations about end-of-life issues, but also engendering that trust that you describe that you have in your home country. Yes?
I think it was Plato that said, study of philosophy is a way of learning how to die. I'm wondering if you think our culture has consciously put this endeavor of learning out of its mind, or do you think this is happening through other processes subtly?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, that's an interesting point. It's difficult for us to talk about these issues. I know when I talk to my students about questions of the meaning of life, I often quote Tolstoy's article, My Confessions, where he says, we should look at the question of whether the inevitability of death renders our lives meaningless. And he said there are those people who confront the questions and recognize the absurdity of life and go out and kill themselves. Those are the true philosophers. And then there are those who recognize the absurdity of life and are too cowardly to kill themselves, and those are the students who live their lives of aimless frustration. And then he said, unfortunately, women, children, and idiots never think about these questions, and so that's problematic as well. It is difficult to confront the question of whether death means that our lives have no meaning, and if it doesn't mean that, how we could live our lives so that they do have meaning. I think in general, we're not very good at thinking about these issues because we get caught up in just surviving day to day. And it's a luxury to some extent to think about these questions in philosophy class. But that's an interesting point. And in one way in response to this other question, one way we could address the problems that we're facing is to encourage the study of philosophy. And we were talking at lunch about this. One of my colleagues, Emma Holyoke, teaches philosophy for children and uses books like The Giving Tree and gets children to talk about issues of death and life and meaning from very early ages. And so perhaps that's one way to go, is to teach philosophy to children and make it a part of our culture.
Alistair McIntyre and Michael Sandel have championed the idea of the self as a narrative agent, and that to make sense of our lives we have to tell a story. And the story has to come to a conclusion. That's death. So are there any endeavors to make the meaning of death more approachable in telling people, the well-lived life tells a story, comes to a conclusion, and without it, and that connects with some of the considerations of the person, it's just sort of doing the thought experiment on endless life. And without it coming to a conclusion, it has to be meaningless.
Yeah, I mean, that's one perspective. Another, I was reading a book recently, the Cheneysville incident, and in that narrative, one of the protagonists says, the real tragedy of death is that your story is no longer told from your perspective. It's always told from the perspective of another. And so looking at that notion of narrative and removing ourselves from our own narrative is the real tragedy in death. I don't know if that's true. But that was an equally compelling argument, I think.
It seems pretty clear to me that what you're talking about today is very important. You're raising important philosophical questions, and related to those, there are important factual questions, important policy questions. And it seems obvious that we should be persuading people to engage philosophically with those issues. But shouldn't we go farther? Shouldn't we go beyond persuasion? Shouldn't we recognize that the undergraduate curriculum is primarily intended to prepare people for the rest of their lives and for dealing with the rest of the people and the rest of the things in the world? Shouldn't we have undergraduate curriculums that guarantee that every student who goes through college will have been exposed to the important questions and the most important facts?
Well, I think that's the value of liberal education, and I'm certainly an advocate of liberal education, and I think it is a responsibility of ours to teach students to think critically, and as part of a liberal education. And the value that I provided on ethics committees, as I mentioned earlier, came as much from that, being able to frame issues from a philosophical perspective as a result of having liberal arts education. So the physicians who came in were extraordinary scientists and technicians. They agonized over these fundamental questions of human existence and needed some help working through those issues. And so the more that we can do to teach students to identify issues, to propose, construct, and evaluate arguments, to anticipate and respond to objections, I think the better we will be as a society in confronting these issues. And we have to re-envision liberal learning in a way that includes practical application to some of these issues.
And there isn't really a strong enough current of sentiment in this country for revisioning the undergraduate education.
That's right. I think that there is a push. Yeah.
So I guess my suggestion to you is that I think what you're talking about is so important that it would be reasonable for you to make an affirmative proposal. It would be reasonable for you to say every college undergraduate should be given the opportunity and should be forced to take the opportunity to consider these questions and the relating factual background.
Well, I think there's room for pre-professional education and technical education that's apart from the core liberal learning that takes place in universities and colleges across the country. But yeah, I think that is incumbent upon us to make that argument. And the challenge is, of course, always faculty autonomy and academic freedom. But I think the two are consistent.
And I think, excuse me, one of the main reasons why we don't actually talk about death is because it's such a unknown topic that I know a lot of students might have trouble accepting it because there's no hard facts on what happens when we die. So I think that's one of the main problems why that, institutions don't actually teach about death and the important questions that arise from it.
Yeah, and it could be that there's we talk about the separation of church and state, and so much of our conversation around death has been faith-based. And so maybe there's a fear about confronting these issues because people's attitudes, once you start talking about ensoulment and what's going to happen after death, then we think that we're not authorities on that, or there's no legitimacy within public institutions.
I think that's a big issue too when you were talking about shopping for physicians. I feel pretty strongly about my desires, and so I do tend to do that because I don't want to have a physician that will not allow me to do what I want to do when it comes to that choice. And there are, religious or ethical questions that somebody else might have as values and not respect that decision. That's a question for me to you. Do you, as a physician, are you ever prepared to say you have to go beyond what you believe and go with what the patient desires?
Yeah, I think what I believe has very little to do with it.
But there are cases in this town that we've had to move people from one hospital to another because of the care of the patient not being respected. There was a woman that wanted to abort the child to save her life, and they wouldn't do it at St. Pat's, things like that.
Right.
I mean, do you feel that
do you find that surprising?
Do you feel that most physicians would go with something they didn't believe in if that was the patient's wish?
You mean they believed was wrong?
Or if say you didn't want to have treatment and they felt you should have the treatment?
It's hard to say. I mean, physicians are...
Right, but I think that's different because that's why we shop for physicians. Because if you have a good relationship with someone, I think you have an ability to work with them more closely. And
the only other thing I would say, just thinking about this, there's nothing that I know of about the medical care system in the United States that has any rational basis. Nothing, the dialogue is irrational, purposefully irrational, like this death panels and stuff. People like Grassley, who knew it wasn't true, weren't saying it. Why should the system be determined by what, for instance, doctors think is right? The doctors are the employees as near as I can tell. But the rhetoric has been influenced by doctors since the 40s, so that when you say, why is the argument different here, it's because the well was poisoned in the 40s by the American Medical Association in an active campaign about socialized medicine and so on. And it goes hand in glove with this sort of Western, I'm taking care of myself and I take care of my people, even though that's horseshit. None of us are really doing that. And doctors believe that they got there because all the hard work they did, never mind what society has into it. The belief about what's happened to our healthcare system or our ability to fight disease, like you said, people feel technologically. It's not really true. We know that life expectancy has doubled since the 1900s, but that's the life expectancy at birth. The life expectancy of a 10-year-old has hardly changed at all. So the rhetoric or the discussion has been framed by people who have a vested interest a long time ago. So the facts are not even at issue because they're not known. They're hardly known at all.
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome. Thank you.